Good afternoon, it's Lee Cassidy from Tactile Technology. And instead of my usual topics where we talk about technology, we talk about physical and cybersecurity in general, but we're actually going to talk a bit more about getting to work in the cyberspace, but also talk about what happened a week ago because it's quite topical. So I'm just going to join in our guest, which is Pete Hayes. So, Pete, tell us a little bit about yourself and that, because not everybody will know who you are or where you're from.
Sure. My name is Pete Hay. I'm the CEO of Arbiter Security. My background is like most people, I came to cyber a very natural way where I was a nuclear chemist. So you can see the natural career progression for me
Definitely.
while I was in the while I was in the United States Navy. But it was coming home for me because I've been a nerd since being a small boy, and this was a place where I got a chance to kind of live that dream. I worked at the NSA for a couple of years. I worked all across industry, largely supporting cybersecurity, teaching, developing content, things like that. And now founding Arbiter Security last November.
Right. So one of the things we're going to talk about is your Wanna Cyber podcast, and we're going to discuss some of the topics that you're talking about and try and encourage people to follow it. So that would be a good thing to kick off with. So, why did you place and what are you trying to achieve with it?
So, like many people, when you start a podcast, you have to have an ulterior motive. I think it's the law, and mine was to get a chance to catch up with friends of mine that are ostensibly too busy to talk to me. And it's worked swimmingly thus far. But the reality is, I have, I'm an analyst by trade and by nature, and so when analysts look at the world, we see it a little bit differently. And I think anyone who knows me well would say I am perhaps more than most. I see it a little differently. And so I wanted to share a little bit of my perspective on what I've seen in cybersecurity, because I have a very people-focused perspective of cyber. I think that's the dirty secret of cybersecurity is that for all the tech and for all of the money and innovation that goes on, ultimately it's people who still design the tech, employ the tech, et cetera. And so I have kind of a people focus when it comes to cyber. And so I wanted to share that. And the way that's manifested is we're talking about getting jobs, finding good career options, building healthy, ethical companies, et cetera, what that looks like inside, and kind of applying that to tech and cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people, have this assumption that technology will fix all. A week ago, we saw that actually that's the opposite in some cases. But there is no silver bullet, really, is there? And it really comes down to communications, decision making, and people skills to analyze what's happening and deal with the situation. So it is challenging, isn't it, working in this space?
I think there's an old quote about the challenge with opportunity is it often comes disguised as hard work, and I think that's the people side. I think we're often looking for, if I only employ this technology, it'll cost me this much and it'll solve a lot of my problems. It still requires hard work to implement, use effectively policies to support it, people that actually embrace those policies. It is complicated. It is, just because the concept is simple does not mean that the implementation is not difficult.
Yeah, and also it's planning as well. So planning for having an incident and who's responsible, communications internally and externally during an incident as well. And a lot of people forget that, and they just implement technology and don't think about how we're going to use it, how we're going to talk to people, how we're going to make meeting our compliance requirements as well. So I'm sure over the weeks we're going to talk about some of those areas, part of your discussions in Wanna Cyber.
Yeah, exactly. That's because that's the extension is, we start with how do you get into cyber. We touch on, how do you be a good employer? How do you get those good people in cyber? How do you identify companies? Is this relationship between me and the company healthy? Is it a quid pro quo relationship or is it something that I want to invest myself into? And then we turn it into is like, okay, now you're here, you're established, you're starting to build the foundation. Where do you go from there? So our most
Yeah.
recent episode, which we've recorded but haven't released yet, is all about building a career in cyber, even if you don't find that perfect corporate fit. How do you kind of intentionally build a career inside cybersecurity long term?
Okay. Anybody's watching live, if you do want to ask any questions, put them in the comments, whichever platform you're on, and we'll bring those questions to Pete. Or if you're focusing any questions towards me, you'll get live answers. If not, if you post any questions later on, we'll keep an eye on the feed and respond to any questions that come in if you do watch this as recorded at a later base. But kicking off, then we want to talk really about what happened last Friday. And I think it's quite interesting, what happened there. It was a bit out of the blue, and we had a massive impact. So there are a lot of ambulance chasers around, trying to sell technology, sending offers of help. I've received emails myself, I don't know about you, of offers of help to fix the problem and resolve it. But there are other connotations. We know in the background there are some more nefarious things happening where people are sending out alternatives versions of Microsoft's USB key supposed to fix it, which is not definitely not going to fix it. So what are your thoughts then on what actually happened to start with, and then subsequently what lessons have we learned?
Well, I think the really important thing, the lesson learned from the CrowdStrike is there was no avoiding this if you're a CrowdStrike customer. And there was no indication that being a CrowdStrike customer was a bad thing. I love their product. I think it's a fantastic tool. There's a reason they have loyal customers. There's a reason that it is so ubiquitous in the space and therefore had so much impact. So there was no magic bean that was going to solve this. There's no ducking it. So, you and I've talked about ambulance chasers for a while. I find it offensive when somebody comes out and says, if you just had our technology, you'd be fine.
Mm.
You know what? There are dedicated professionals all over the world working their their hindquarters off to stay ahead of this as best they can. This is not the moment. This is the moment to actually. I heard a story from a friend of mine over at Huntress, how in the early days of Huntress, they sent pizzas to people who were having a bad day with a breach. They didn't market on it. They didn't capitalize on it. That's the kind of ethos that I think belongs in this space. The other thing we joke about on our podcast a lot is an acronym which is a DCTFL, which stands for Don't Click the Link. And the that won't save you. Like there was no expensive fix, there was no cheap fix. This is a vendor issue, and I'm sure people are going to talk a lot about it going forward and how you do change controls and testing and things like that to prevent it in the future. And I'm confident those changes will be coming to CrowdStrike. But there was no avoiding this if you were a customer. And anyone who says you should have known this was coming, they're just I think it's disingenuous at this point, or
I think
certainly
the other thing
benefits
is
from hindsight.
automation. A lot of people think automation is the way to do a lot of things, and AI is talked about a lot in cyber at the moment. But neither of those would actually do anything about this. It wouldn't stop it happening, and it wouldn't have helped you, recover from it either.
Right, and there was you sent me an article from one of your friends, and I thought there were some great conclusions in there.
Yeah, that
Do
was
you want to?
an article from Glenn Hymers who raised it today about some of the key aspects, and I thought it was really interesting what he put in there.
I thought the key takeaway there was the need for resilience. I think if one were going to say something about this whole CrowdStrike incident, say that any takeaway should be gleaned, it is the need for resilience, which comes back to people. So of course, I'm very much in support of it. So obviously, Glenn's a genius, and I support him wholeheartedly because we agree. But
I'm sure he'd
the
love that.
yeah, I know it means a great deal to him. He was, I'm sure it'll make his morning. But that need for resilience is, it's with people, and his recommendations were things like redundant systems. I don't know that there was really a way that redundant systems would solve this particular situation, but it is a good best practice. And if you were to run into another technical issue, um, back in the day when I used to run exercises for Fortune 10 companies, it was something we would do regularly, which was have that won the lottery test, which is say, okay, senior person that everyone relies on, you won the lottery and didn't come to work today. And now the team has to scramble. We would do the same thing with tools. Say, we have disabled EDRs like CrowdStrike and said, nope, now you have to figure out how to use sysmon logs to get the data you need, and you have to respond using your firewalls or group policy or what have you. And that built resilience. Same thing with regular testing was another recommendation of his. Layered security. Without layered security and redundant systems, you can't take an EDR out of the loop and still respond effectively. And of course, the regular testing is how you make sure that your resilient responses are adequate with those systems. And then, of course, compliance with regulation was his fourth. And I think that's because we work in cyber, and if we don't say that, someone shows up with a black bag and drags us off into a closet somewhere.
Yeah, and I
So,
think
um,
compliance is becoming more important because there are a lot of people these days breaking compliance, and they're also breaking the law because of the restrictions now put on key infrastructure providers and things around protecting their assets against cyber attack. This wasn't a cyber attack in itself, was it? It was effectively a cyber defense system that was compromised by an update that caused the issue in the first place. So it's a slightly different scenario, but the outcome was the same.
yeah, and again, I think this is one of those tricky situations where I don't know that there's any regulation that stops, fixes, or prevents this when it
Mm.
is, you coming from a military background understand the root cause analysis that, there's this whole Swiss cheese theory when it comes to quality assurance and failure. And we put multiple layers of protections in place. And when we get a failure of this magnitude, it's not, it's, it is rare that it bypassed, that there are multiple layers that were inadequate. It just happened that all the holes lined up on this one. And so that's why the impact is so great, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to re-examine that and work on adding additional layers or refactoring the types of controls that are in place. And I think that's where the regulations come in, is making sure that there are those multiple layers of defenses. And then even with the least likely statistically failures, that doesn't mean zero chance. You can essentially continue to reduce the likelihood, but you may not necessarily hit zero. And I think this is just one of those. I hesitate to say unlucky, because I feel like that belittles the experience, the lived experience of the victims of this situation. But it is ultimately misfortune that has brought this about. Um, just in the fullness of time, eventually something like this may have
But, but
occurred.
But if you consider things like cyber products, they're always looking at insight data and doing updates based on that insight data, whether that's different protection levels, different levels of behavior and things. So they've got to be able to update on quickly in the background without anyone's intervention to ensure that the clients are protected. Yeah, and that's one of the problems with this. It's not something you could have tested at the customer end. It needed to be tested more thoroughly at the actual vendor's end before it was released, really, to stop this happening. But if we look at the situation, we had a mass outage. I think they were predicting 8.5 million endpoints were affected, but there were machines that couldn't be quickly recovered. There'd need to be a level of manual intervention to do it, which expanded the amount of time. So even if it was 10 minutes for each one of those machines times 8.5 million, that's a massive amount of man hours just to recover. But also the impact must have been enormous on some businesses if they were fully reliant, they were fully digitally converted, because that's a big thing that's been talked about for some time, isn't it? That digital transformation of an organization. And most are, near 100% digital these days, and the way they transact with clients, where they transact with suppliers and other partners. So once you lose that digital infrastructure, you can't do business. The impact on business must have been enormous.
And I don't think we've seen the end of the impact. I mean, think about the second and third order impact of thousands of attackers, or hundreds of APTs have now gotten a close look at the defenses utilized by large organizations. And
Yeah.
one of the CrowdStrike hangs its hat on the quality of their defenses, and they are excellent. But that doesn't mean that defense evasion is impossible. And when an adversary now knows what they're going up against, that takes away a lot of the home field advantage for the defenders. And I think there's second order effect and third order effect that we have yet to fully experience as a consequence of some of the knowledge seepage that's come out of the situation as well. So that'll be interesting to see how organizations adapt to that. Are they gonna go belt and suspenders and use a secondary EDR solution? Are they going to What are they gonna do? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and like you say, that surveillance impact. So a lot of these, bad guys now know who's using CrowdStrike, because they've seen these outages. They know which systems are being impacted, so they've got a good feel now for who to go after with particular attacks.
And who's not. I mean, think about some of
Yeah,
the things we learned in the airline industry. We learned that Southwest uses Windows 3.1 for some of their critical systems, and so as a result, they were able to keep flying. And people were bragging about this. If you haven't seen the Southwest Airlines Twitter account during it, it was hilarious. But the information seepage was also significant, and so like I said, I don't think we've seen the end of the second and third order effects from this.
yeah, and I think it's a critical thing for the hackers really to understand that background information. So it was invaluable what this did for them, giving them that understanding of who does and who doesn't use CrowdStrike in this respect. So interesting piece. So what recommendations would you give for to an organisation going forward to try and I'm sure, from what we said, there's little chance of it stopping it happening, but how, could they better respond to this type of situation?
Well, if I had to make a recommendation, like I said, I struggle with this situation because in some ways it's so big that there is no perfect answer. And it is so unexpected that I think back to the Inspector Clouseau movies where he's constantly training for the unexpected by having,
Yeah,
his man attack him. I think there are limits to how far you can go to prepare, but if one were, like I mentioned, our company, we design exercises for corporations where they can do cyber resilience. These types of loss of capabilities or loss of function can be designed into them. Tabletop exercises are also a great example for how you test out the human component of recovery and response to a situation like this. Because I think that's one of the more challenging aspects is what do you as a senior leader do when something of this magnitude occurs? What are those first steps? Is your incident response plan viable for this? Because I one of the things, again, it comes back to people. Incident response plans are designed by the limits of people's imagination.
yeah,
You think, I very much doubt that incident response plans have, a massive power outage, covering half of the UK. I can't imagine that there are many incident response plans that are adequate for that. But but that could have occurred. So, there's the limits of reality, et cetera. But tabletops are the place where you can push at the bounds of what is expected, what is normal. And the beauty of it is you can weave in these things that are abnormal or beyond the expected without having a massive business cost or disruption. And at least build that resiliency in terms of the thinking of the people involved.
yeah. Because I think it's not only making the decisions; it's having the right people making the decisions. And sometimes, when you put up into a situation like last Friday, everybody would have been running around like headless chickens, not knowing what to do, because it was so unexpected. It was extraordinary, wasn't it? Wasn't something anyone had ever considered might happen. So a very very different situation.
Yeah, in most cases, you want a process, right? If there's a process, a plan, policy, et cetera, those things, then you don't get unexpected actions or outcomes from it. Because people we'd like to think that we're rational and reliable and so on and so forth, but we each have our own perspective on it. And so there's a subjective aspect to human thought process. But when it comes to these edge cases, You can't have a policy for every edge case. So what you need is a resilient workforce. I call it substituting excellence for process or framework. And all of these organizations, they have excellent people in the senior levels. So we want to refine that excellence. We want to evaluate those emergency actions so that your instinct. Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about training the subconscious in his book Blink. And though there are parts of that book that the research has later been proven to not be perfect, but I think the idea of training your gut by facing these difficult situations, testing and evaluating, yes, this was a good idea, no, that was a bad idea. And then as a result, your instinct gets better in these situations. Not that you could ever predict this particular situation,
No,
but
no.
adverse situations in general means that your instincts for adverse situations improve.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to consider as well is because of the tight integration with a lot of these security products within platforms like Windows, this could happen again. And yeah, if somebody doesn't check and distributes a large update, there's a good chance it's going to happen again. It's just making sure we've got those controls in place that we can do. One, try to ensure it doesn't, but also be able to deal with and recover from as quickly as possible if it does.
Yeah, the solution is not to run out and buy a bunch of Macs necessarily.
No, no.
It's not security or stability through obscurity. You've got a bunch of
Windows
FreeBSD
3.1
machine.
machine.
Yeah, I cannot imagine that is a more stable, an inherently stable
Yeah,
environment. But at the same time, I was on submarines, and back in the day, they ran on older operating systems. And you'd be shocked to hear this, but we really liked surfacing. And so the idea of changing those operating systems and potentially altering those systems was not popular in our environment. So I do understand where Southwest is coming from. So I know it sounds like I'm criticizing, and I am, but I also understand why when it comes to safety, and you have something that has a long track record of safety and reliability, you can be reticent to make changes.
I think the other thing to consider though is those were air gap systems,
Yes.
on the subs, and we had archaic systems in aviation as well in the Royal Air Force, but again they're all air gap systems, so there was no way for this type of thing to happen to them. They were protected because of that air gap. But when you've got the world we have today with this interconnection between everything, it makes things quite different. So
Yeah,
I think we've run over time. We're at 22 minutes past. So we're going to try and keep this to 20 minutes. So any final words that you want to say before we just to have a refresh on Wanna Cyber?
no, I just really appreciate the time, and it's always nice chatting with you, Lee.
All right. So just going back to Wanna Cyber. So if you want to see Wanna Cyber, that's a YouTube channel for it. You can search for it using Wanna Cyber. And what we'll do next week, next Friday, same time, 2 o'clock, we're going to talk about what's been discussed in the last release of Wanna Cyber, and talk about the industry in general and how, if you're looking to get into it, how do you get in? But also, once you're in it, how do you validate your skills to help you move on and progress up that greasy pole, as it tends to be in a lot of these technology companies, trying to climb higher, get the bigger bucks as you go along. Right, thanks ever so much, Pete. And if you want to hang on afterwards when we shut things down, and I'll speak to you in a few minutes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Like I say, we're going to be here 2 o'clock next week. So join us then, and we're going to talk about Wanna Cyber. And if anything else has cropped up in the meantime, we may introduce that as well. So thank you very much for joining us, those who've joined us live. Anybody who's joined us actually in the background on the recording, join us again. Thank you very much.